This segment is brought to you in part by Swim Baits Plus. Are you looking for that hard to find swim bait? Are you looking for that impossible rare color? Are you looking for great prices? Visit them on Instagram at @SwimBaitsPlus. Well, welcome to our Trophy Hunter segment, everybody. Our guest is a 20-year tour professional. He's got 23 top 10 finishes, qualified for 7 Bassmaster Classics, qualified for 5 FLW Tour Championships, 2 FLW Tour wins, 3-time WAN Bass U.S. Open champion. 3-time U.S. Open champion. He's won over $2 million in career winnings. Cliff Pirch, welcome to the show. Thanks for being with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on, guys. This whole Zoom meeting era has sure changed things. So I've been able to do quite a few of these deals.
Me too. I mean, I'm in California, and I talk to guys all over the country every week. This wouldn't be able to happen for a California guy without Zoom. I mean, if you were going to look for positives in all this quarantine stuff, I learned how to use Zoom, I guess.
Yeah. I'm one of the most technologically challenged outdoorsmen there is. So if I can figure out how to get on here, it takes a couple tries, like we saw a few minutes ago, but somehow it must be good if it works.
Yeah. Hey, all those things I just talked about, the 3 U.S. Open championships, the FLW wins, the 7 classics, and I think you're going to make it for the 8th, aren't you?
Well, that's kind of a tricky one right now. We've got one event next week on Lake Fork, and I'm lower than I've ever been in the standings. So I've really got to have a good tournament. I've come up in the last couple of events, but I'm still about probably 6 spots low on the standings. So I've got to have a big tournament, and hopefully maybe even get a win at Lake Fork. But I definitely need to probably get a top 15 or top 10 finish.
Well, we'll be pulling for you, that's for sure. As I was going to say, which of those things are you most proud of?
Boy, that's a tricky one. I think at different points in your career, you deal with different challenges, and life throws a lot of different things at you. So, right now I've got a little string of classic qualifications going, and we're seeing this year that I am really, really on the outside right now trying to get in. So, that's a tricky one. So I feel like I'm pretty fortunate to have done that little string of 7, the previous 7 classics. But at the same time, I haven't won a big event in a while. So while my consistency has gotten better, my home runs have kind of slacked off here lately. So, I really feel like it was pretty special to win those U.S. Opens. And I had several that I was within an ounce or 2 or just a bite, that I could have won another one. And a couple other times where I was leading and didn't, ended up in the top 5. So that was really a special event for me for quite a few years. The schedule has been tricky, over the last few years to try to get there and be, really be present. Last year I got to go and I got 8th place, but, just to really be in the Western zone, where you need to be in order to get a win, hopefully the schedules line up eventually and I can start getting back there. But, those things are really important to me as well. And so, I guess in order to have a long career, you need some consistency, but I sure would like to put a win back in the win column here soon again. It would be real nice to get a big win.
I'm sure it's going to happen. So this segment is primarily geared towards talking about the big trophy-sized fish. But you said something on the weigh-in stand at Chickamauga a couple of weeks ago that it just totally resonated with me because I understand what you're talking about. You're weighing in, and you had a less than stellar day, and you told the weigh-in guy that that you got a problem, that you're addicted to swim baits. What did you mean by that?
Well, anyone that throws this big swim bait, you see the evidence and the possibility of weighing a giant bag. Every time you throw it, it almost seems like you get some big follows, and occasionally they bite. And so you kind of get that in your mind that if I could get those 3 or 5 bites, I could really do this. And so it's an addictive thing to be able to catch a different class of fish than what you're mostly catching most of the time. And it's something that gets into you once you get that bite, where they try to jerk the rod out of your hands, and it's just a violent, 6, 7, 8 pounder. It bothers you. So it's hard to put it down. And, as a tournament fisherman, that can be a real strength, but it can be a real weakness. And probably 20 years ago, I had it, and I joked about it. I said, it's a condition. I made this syndrome up, but I called it Carl's Byron, because if you've been following swim bait fishermen for long, Byron and Carl and those guys have had some big events, and then a lot of not great events, because they're known for kind of sticking to that stuff. And I said, on stage last week that, they may have overcome it, but it appears that I've succumbed to the Carl's Byron syndrome here lately again. And like I said, I've had a pretty consistent last 7 or 8 years, but I've been missing the big wins. And so that's been another thing in my mind, is to try to gamble a little bit more. And I've seen the dangers of gambling, but I haven't seen the win, and I did win a Western event this spring with a big swim bait, but in general, I haven't seen the big event win. And so I've been trying to balance that consistency with a little bit of gamble, and man, it's a really tricky thing to do when you see some of those big ones follow you on the swim bait, or you get a couple bites in practice, and it's a hard thing to put down. But a couple years ago, 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, Josh Bertrand and Roy Hawk and James Elam, they introduced me to this guy, Randall. I think it's Randall Kirkpatrick. He's a Georgia swim bait designer. He's one of these custom handmade designs that when you see the bait, it's like, oh my gosh, it looks like a live gizzard shad. And of course, it's like an addiction. It's like a person with a drug problem. These guys introduced me to it, and while they may have had the stamina or the wherewithal to know when and where to put it down, it's kind of got in my blood the last year or two, and just because I've caught so many 6-pounders and even some close to 10 on it, but it's one of those things where you can put a big fish in the boat with it, but you have got to know when to put it down, because it, out of all that time, I probably could have had a jig in my hand, or a drop shot, or a shaky head, or a little miniature swim bait, just to get the bites, to get the ball rolling, and stay in the game. And I've had a couple of gambled days that have cost me lately, but it's a fun thing. It's an addictive thing. And if you're just a fun fisherman or a weekend angler, it's a blast. I mean, it really is fun throwing those big baits. But if you're a tournament guy, you've got to be really careful. It's hard to put it down.
Okay, now I talk to a lot of guys on this podcast, and they always talk about having swim baits out there, but their definition of a swim bait is a little 2.5-inch kai tack on a small dart head. And when we're talking about swim baits, we're talking about the big 8, 10-inch baits that you have on your deck during the course of a tournament. How important is that swim bait to your tournament fishing?
Well, it is important, because you are able to get some bites that just regular tackle doesn't provoke very often. You can catch one on a 4-inch drop shot worm. There's times where I've caught giant ones doing that. But in general, when you target a giant fish with a big fish bait, you get one every now and then. And you see fish that are used to seeing a lot of little baits go by and don't bite, so it's a pretty important tool, but again, you're talking about a guy that's in the middle of a weakness right now. So it's a neat thing. It's a neat thing, but I'll show you. I've got a couple of them right here. I didn't know if you wanted to see what
Certainly.
I
It's always fun when we get to look into a guy's tackle box.
don't know if I can get that in front of the. Can you see that?
Yeah, definitely. It's about a 7 or 8 inch glide bait.
Let's see here if I can get it off.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can get that in the sun right. I'm trying to balance the rod and hold the bait here, but
It looks to be about a 7.5 inch glide bait. Is that in the right ballpark?
it's a little smaller than that, but it's a big one. It's the bigger variety, and it's something that, like I said, it's been an addiction to me. I broke my favorite one the other day. The same day I caught the giant one at Chickamauga. I broke the tail on it a little bit, but it's the same bait that I just showed you. Just had a spot on it, and that one didn't have the shad spot. But here's another one. Historically, this is Byron's old the Rego, the big one.
Yeah.
And that's another one. Really can get you some big bites. It's the line through style, so it's pretty good landing ratio if you get them hooked up. But those are a couple of them I use, and then I've also got the Big Bite Baits Suicide Shad, and it's a little more common because it's only it's a 6-inch hollow belly, that they throw on a jig head a lot, and that's been a pretty good one. And one of my roommates, I've been staying with Garrett Paquette a little bit this last 2 years, and that's one of his favorites on a jig head on an offshore structure spot. That's a good way to really get a big one too. So those are a few of them that I use, and that glide has probably been the worst part of my swim bait addiction here more recently. It's really something it's hard for me to put down, and I really didn't throw a glide bait, back very very long back. It's something that's newer to me, and I wanted to kind of test it out and kind of learn about it a little bit because I had some friends that do it, and so it's something I've thrown a whole lot in the last 2 years, but prior to that, I really hadn't thrown it that much. So it's a little bit newer to me, but I've caught an awful lot of big ones on it now.
Well, now, Cliff, I can attest to what you're talking about. The number of days that I have seen 30-pound limits swimming around where I'm fishing, following my swim bait to the boat, I couldn't count them. But you look in the live well at the end of the day, there's nothing there. How about the swim bait's ability to locate fish? Is that an important thing for you, say, in pre-fish?
Yeah, and that's definitely something that is if you talk to the big bait guys, I'll give you another guy. Steve Kennedy is another one, man.
Steve. Yeah, talked to Steve before.
We've been in the same flight this year, so we're always weighing in at the same time. Seems like we're always next to each other. With the last 2 guys to check in our flight every single time. So we talk about that quite a bit, and he's really good at locating and using them. He does that almost specifically all through his practice. I try to get a little more variety in my practice and do a lot of different things, but that is definitely a good way to get a follow, to kind of locate a big one. Maybe there's a brush pile where you could go back to a lay down, something like that, and it's a good way to locate them. So you could go back and maybe catch them on it, if the conditions are right. But it almost might be more productive to go back and catch them on a jig or a worm or like a weightless worm or something like that, where you're a little bit more apt to get the bite because you've already located the fish. But again, if you got the right conditions, it's sure fun when it works.
Well, now talking about pre-fish for an elite level, an elite series event, you're going to get out and you're going to throw that swim bait around, and you're going to see some big fish for sure. I'm imagining you're probably going to mark them with waypoints. You come back and throw that same swim bait at them, or do you target them with a jig or something smaller, or how does that usually work out for you?
Well, I guess it depends on a couple of things. One, I'm gonna watch the conditions. If the conditions are not good for throwing that glide bait, I'm gonna probably shy away from it. Or if I hooked it in practice, sometimes I'm going without hooks bent over. Uh, sometimes I've got them bent over and sometimes I don't. So, if I'm on a place where you got to be able to see the fish, I've got to hook some. Unfortunately, you get some of those giants in practice and you might have to go back with a different bait. But there's other places where you might be able to see the fish that bites your bait and just mark them and be able to go back. And if the conditions are right, say you might have some wind, if you feel like they're active, a lot of times I want to look for an active feeding cycle to get them to bite, because what it'll do is it'll draw them out again, but again, you're just basically going to get them to follow you and not bite if it's kind of a negative feeding cycle. So it's definitely something that, I'm paying attention to the type of conditions I'm in. But if they're marginal conditions, that's where the addiction part gets you. that's the problem when you think, I think I can make it happen, and that's where it can cause you an issue. But at the same time, I've caught some real big fish that made a big deal for me, on it as well.
The new Frantic by Trophy Bass Baits is a 3-piece segmented glide style swim bait. They call it that because, well, it's frantic. Check them out by going to @SwimBaitsPlus. Talked about conditions. You mentioned wind. Wind is important. It breaks up the visibility. The fish don't get quite as good a look at it. What do you think about a falling barometer? I've heard a lot of people talk about falling barometers, maybe stormy kind of conditions. Is that what you're looking at, or what else besides just wind?
Yeah, a lot of times that is a real active period, throughout the year. If it's falling, if you've got a storm approaching, the opposite would be more post-frontal, where it would probably be a negative time and probably a poor time to choose it. Um, in the spring, you've got a little bit different stuff going on where as the water warms, you might have real great weather, but they might be drawn up to some heavy cover, shallow, where you can target them and get them in bluebird skies, when it's nice, because they've come up there, they're feeding a little bit, they're happy, they're excited about the warming weather. So, nice weather in the spring is different than nice weather in the fall,
Right.
so, and at the same time, when you've got an approaching front or a falling barometer, like you were talking about, regardless of the time of year, that's likely to be an active time for them to be feeding. So that is a good time to probably be trying it and throwing it. If you can get a little bit of, if you can get it right close to cover, sometimes you get more opportunity to trick them. If it's a real quick reactive where they don't see it from 100 miles away, and it surprises them and it's in their face. If they're in a location where you can get it right in front of them, sometimes that works real well. Another time is if the water has a little bit of color to it where you can't get a real great look. I don't like it at all in real dirty water, but I do like it if there's just a little bit of stain that might blur it just a little bit coming by. Sometimes that's a good way to get them to go ahead and bite it instead of follow it too. So, and those are a couple of things. We talked about wind and clouds and rain. If they're just straight actively feeding, you might really get to see the potential of something, throwing a bait like that all day. But in general, you don't get to pick your conditions out there, and you get, everything gets thrown at you. So you've got to have that discretion when and when not to.
Can you talk about a tournament where swim baits made a positive effect? Because we're not going to talk about the ones where they made a negative effect, but talk about an event, a high finish or something like that, where the swim bait was an instrumental part of your finish.
Well, just last week we talked about that Chickamauga event, and it was obviously the tournament I made it for 3 days. It's a 4-day tournament. I made it till the day 3 cut,
Semis, yeah.
17th or something. And, but on day 2, late in the day, there was a little breeze picking up. There was quite a bit of current coming down the river. And, the sun had got behind the trees, so it was a real dark bank. So I had really, really good conditions for it. And late in the day, I threw it up, in a couple of really good little pockets along a rocky bluff that had some lay down wood, and just got a giant one. Just tried to take the rod out of my hand. When they're fully committed like that, it's, and a lot of times when you've got a really good looking bait like that, they do commit to it. They're going to try to get it before it gets to the boat. They want it so bad. If you've got the opposite conditions, sometimes they will follow it to the boat and not commit. But that Chickamauga tournament a couple of weeks ago, or I guess it was a little over a week ago, day 2, I caught a giant one, and that obviously made a big difference. Now I'll give you the flip side of that. Day 3, I went and I wanted to recreate that same deal, and that's where you get in trouble. And it didn't happen for me. I got 2 big ones to follow and another nice one to follow it, and I think I just didn't let the sun get low enough on the hill. I tried, you're under a time gun, so you want to, you're pushing when you can get it done. But I went through a couple of those areas early and showed it to them and just didn't get them. So, that's an example of when it can bite you, trying to force it after you've seen it happen.
Well, that Chickamauga tournament was a really, really tough tournament. So a 6-pounder in that event is a grand slam.
Oh yeah, and it was a 614, and that made a huge difference. Every bite counted. I didn't get a limit every day, and most guys didn't. I think there was only 2 guys in the field that got a limit every day, and looking back, I really wished I would have done some of my little tricky stuff and messed with the jig a little bit and stuff like that, just to try to get those bites a little bit earlier. But there were so few bites and you got so little evidence that if you had something, you knew if you stuck with it, you would get a couple. That's kind of what I had to do. And I was flipping a big creature bait from Big Bite Baits and throwing that big swim bait. And that was my main 2 deals. I got a couple on top, but we were mainly post frontal, and it was hard. It was that kind of fall transition where they weren't biting. It's probably pretty decent now, but it was just that perfect wrong time in the fall. A lot of times it's that first 2 weeks of October where it's
seems like whenever I fish. I mean that near 7-pounder was as big and bigger than some of the limits that were caught in that event, because there were a lot of 1-pound fish caught in that event.
Yeah, and so I knew that one more bite like that, and I would have probably been 5th place. So it was it was a gamble probably worth taking, but I sure would have liked to have had one more. I only needed like a 2.6, I think, to get in the top 10. So I really wished I'd have got one more bite. And I needed those points. Another 10 points would have kind of softened the Lake Fork tournament. So, but that's tournament fishing. You got to make those gambles. And like I said, I've lived on the consistency side the last 7 years or so, and the last year and a half or 2, I've tried to kind of gamble a little bit more, and in hopes of trying to put a couple of big days with some solid days, and that's kind of what you got to do to make that win, or follow a weather transition through the event to start doing the right thing and change to the other right thing when the new right thing develops. That's kind of
while you're on that subject, I kind of jump around a little bit here, but that tournament next week is at Lake Fork. You said you have about 6 spots you got to make up. Is that an event where you're gonna maybe roll those dice and double down on a hand and things like that?
Well, I probably will some. That's going to be a tricky one, because I've got to do it right. I won't get a second chance. But also, when I'm considering, that kind of game plan or that strategy, you also want to consider the type of fishery you're on. If you're going to Clear Lake, the California Delta, if you're going to Lake Fork, Chickamauga, places like that have a lot of really big ones, well, there's probably a little more to gambling with the big bait plan, than going to say a Lake Norman or some of these places that just have a lot of fish, and just there's small differences between winning and 20th place. So
Yeah.
I probably will. Yeah, we'll just see what the evidence gives me over the few days. But in general, Lake Fork has big ones, so I might err on the side of big bites and big fish patterns. Kind of going a little bit dangerously than maybe I normally would. But if you win the Lake Fork event, you're automatically in the Bassmaster Classic. So that it's the Toyota Texas Fest, I think they call it. And so the winner is in. So that's one spot. Or if I finish in the top 15, maybe might need to get top 5 or 10, depending on how the guys do around me. So I've got to have a big finish there. So there'll be some gamble factor.
Do you consider an A rig to be a swim bait? It's not a conventional bait, but do you think of it as a swim bait? Do you fish it a lot in your events?
Well, I love it, but we're not allowed to fish it on the Elite Series, and I wish we could. Even if it was with one hook or two hooks, I think it'd be great. But I'm kind of in the minority. Most of the guys on the tour level or Elite Series, they're kind of against the A rig. I felt like it was more of a knee-jerk reaction to ban it because it's something that it runs its course.
Yeah.
It's not, fish have seen it now, so it's something that I think it was just a great eye opener to how big fish behave. They may not swim over there and eat one bait fish, but if there's 5 of them coming by,
Yeah.
they commit to that, and then you started seeing big fish happen in areas that historically didn't even have big fish. You thought, you just really, it's not a place where you normally caught them. So I think it really taught us a lot about big fish behavior. And I'm for it. I'm not for the guy that hooks 3 of them together and
Right.
you're throwing out a chandelier. But I do think that, if you've got an umbrella rig with some blades or some dummy baits and one hook on one bait or 2 hooks or something like that, I really wish we could do that, because I think it's a neat way to catch fish. In the cold winter months, it really shines. It also shines a couple other times when they're really on shad, like a shad spawn, things like that. But when the fishing's really hard in the wintertime, it definitely shines. So I'm kind of a proponent, but I'm also in the minority. A lot of guys are kind of against it. So it's one of those things, and some places, that those guys live, everybody threw it and won on it, from November to January or February, for a year or two, where they hated it, and so I kind of understand that. But in general, I think it's kind of a neat tool and a neat, what an innovation and what
Yeah.
what an eye opener, what we learned about big fish when that thing came out.
For sure. For sure. All right. So I want to take you through the Elite Series schedule, and I want to talk about some of the different spots and stops that you guys make. And, I think a lot of people, at least in my part of the country, when they think of swim baits, they think of trout. But you're fishing a lot of different waterways, and I know there aren't trout in a lot of those places. So I'm gonna name a couple of stops. You tell me the forage that you're trying to match with the swim bait. Let's start with St. Johns River in Florida.
They've got a lot of shiners, but they've also got a good shad population and some mullet. So definitely a swim bait place, when things are right. Lots of big fish, definitely the opportunity for 10-pound bites. And this year, that's really what set you apart, was getting one big bite. The fishing was tough. We got there and they were going to pull up, and we got a nice warm up. And the first 2 days, we got a wind cancellation because we had a mega wind come in, and it sucked the tide water out and really made for a pretty poor event on the back side of that wind event. So it was unfortunate that it was setting up to be a pretty good tournament, and that would have been, probably something I would have thrown a little bit if you could get around, the water depth wise and grass cover wise. A swim bait would have been a factor. I mean, I had it tied on, and And like I said, you're dealing with some gizzard shad, a lot of shiners, and a lot of mullet there. So and other things, carp, lots of different types of bait, but those would be the big ones.
I smell a rat. Do you want to get in on the rat swim bait craze? Check out You Dirty Rat by Trophy Bass Baits, available at Swim Baits Plus. Visit their Instagram account at Swim Baits Plus and find out what the noise is all about. Okay, how about the northern swing, the St. Lawrence, Lake Champlain, St. Clair? What are you trying to do up there? I know smallmouth eat big baits. I've caught big smallmouth on big baits. So what are you trying to target up there?
So, regarding the swim bait up north, I know some guys, have done well throwing the big glide on Champlain. So you've got some shiners there and you've got some shad there. A lot of those places have turned to they're pretty goby related, and so your bottom baits have become more of a factor. But the smaller swim baits are really good at getting smallmouth bites. The big one definitely will draw some strikes, but if you've got a bait that's really nice like that, the little glide I was showing you, you got muskies and you got pike. So there's some danger if you've got a $400 bait that's tied on your line. A lot of times I'm shying away from throwing them there. I might be using the smaller swim baits. I've got some, just like let's see, can you see that? Yeah, the Pro Swimmer from Big Bite. The smaller shad style baits. A lot of times that's a really good way to go about it, and you're mimicking a lot of those little things. Now the smallmouth, like you were saying, they will bite a big bait, and it's fun, but you've got the musky factor where you could watch that thing go in a heartbeat. So I
don't want to hook no muskie.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. When you were fishing at Chickamauga, what were you trying to mimic, a gizzard shad, or what were you trying to mimic when you were throwing the swim bait?
Yeah. I did see some shiners, similar to gizzard shad length. There was a lot of shiners and there was a lot of big gizzard shad. So, and there was a lot of fresh, small, recently hatched shad that a lot of fish were keying on, and that's partly what made it difficult. So you kind of did need to tone down, but that 614 that I was telling you about that I caught, he was not eating 1-inch shad, and he looked like it looked like the fattest, most gorged up bass you've ever seen. So he definitely was not living on, young of the year shad. He was eating those big gizzards and big shiners and bluegills, crappies, crawdads, stuff that was, using the channel there. And I saw plenty of big bait, in order to warrant using that. But, those giant ones were not keyed on the little bitty shad. A lot of the keepers and a lot of the guys that did well, because it was so hard to get bit, keyed on them. And I wish I would have a little bit more just to try to get a couple extra bites, in retrospect. But at the same time, I was mainly mimicking gizzard shad and shiners.
Now, here's something. One of the swim bait fish that I catch, I tend to catch on bass pattern baits. And the reason I throw a lot of bass pattern baits is because I know that bass eat bass, but I also know they're very territorial. Does that ever enter the picture for you? Are you thinking food or just territorial kind of a presentation?
Well, I think both. And, a lot of times when I'm throwing my gizzard shad glide bait and you're throwing your baby bass glide bait, if we were to throw in the same spot, the same fish would probably bite either one.
That's true.
You know what I mean?
That's
There's
yeah.
a lot of times where he's just, a big bass is opportunistic. And, they, as an opportunistic predator, they're going to take what comes by in front of them that looks right and that looks vulnerable and that looks easy. They're going to take it when they want it. And so, that's why we're giving them that big bait opportunity, whether it be a baby bass or whether it be a big gizzard shad. But, there's nothing wrong with throwing a bass pattern. We obviously know that that they do eat, other bass. That's not uncommon. And especially, I mean, I've seen them in the live well, eat one in their mouth, or you've seen one, just get annoyed with a little one or something, or they just get in the way and they eat them. I don't know what the real trigger is. We could guess on a number of levels, but they eat it. That's the bottom line.
Why don't you? I noticed you got some rods in the background there. Could you kind of go through a couple of the rods you would have on your deck at an Elite Series event that have swim baits tied on them?
Yeah. So I've got one of my absolute favorites this year. I'm trying not to block my camera. I guess I'm blocking the lens. One of my absolute favorites this year is I've been throwing the glide a lot more. Can you see it in there?
Yeah.
Okay. I can't tell if I've got it. This is the Phoenix Recon Elite, and it's the 804 model, and it'll throw a big bait. Here's my shad again. Can't tell if I've got it in front there, but the 804 Recon Elite from Phoenix has become one of my favorites, and it's just it's got a lot of power and strength to throw a heavy big bait, but it's got a soft tip where they will take it in. That bait is easily inhaled. So those treble hooks will go in. I can go ahead and load up and hook them real well on it. So that's become one of my absolute favorites. If I'm throwing something really heavy, one of these big giant, old Regos, one of the old Byron Velvet Regos, sometimes I'll go to the 80 MH or the 80H on the old the Phoenix the M1, and it's basically it's an 8-foot rod, heavy action or medium heavy action. It's designed to be able to sling a big bait and to handle. It's got that big parabolic bend, but still be able to handle throwing the weight on something like that. And I've got another one here. This is the 80H, and it's a little heavier, but I'll show you a little trick. I've got the little cushion on the back end of it. That's something that's just really handy. You can get kind of worn out and tired throwing a giant bait, but you can use it in your armpit or in your elbow as a fulcrum. And I mean, you can throw a giant bait with one arm with just kind of a flick of the wrist. So that's a handy little tool that I've found. And I don't get the luxury of throwing a big giant bait all the time. I've got to be reasonable, but if you're a weekend angler and you enjoy that little cushion on the end of the rod butt is kind of a handy trick for those big baits. It'll cut down on the workload and the strain of throwing it drastically. So it's something I just learned, just kind of messing around with big swim baits, that it cuts down on the work, of throwing a giant, 3-ounce bait. So those are a few of the rods that I really like. I've got a number of others. If I'm throwing a real heavy bottom bouncing, like I was talking about that big suicide shad with like a 3/4 or 1-ounce jig head in it, or if I'm going like up to one of those big old saltwater mullets that might be 1.5 ounces to 2 ounces, then I might go up, to that 80H or even like an 805 on the Recon Elite to just have a little bit more body. It'd be like throwing a real heavy jig. You've got a top hook and it'd be like throwing a giant football jig, basically.
How about reel speeds and line size?
It varies. There are times where a lot of the really good swim baiters are really slow, ultra slow. They just get that tail barely thumping. So using a fast reel is a little bit prohibitive on some of those. The big, Byron's old, Rego and the old Ospreys and all those big, line throughs. Most of the time those guys are throwing those real slow. So a high speed reel is really prohibitive. So I would kind of gear against that. The other thing is on the glide, a lot of times I'm using the reel to move the bait. So, and on the glide, it's not as big a deal, but but a 6.5 is fine on that, where I'm using the reel handle, and like a little bit of a hitch in the turn, where it's getting that bait to dart, and glide. You've got to actually keep the pressure on it, so you've got to keep winding. It's really a hard thing to do with the rod tip, and so it's like a 3/4 of a turn, and then speed it up a little bit and catch that line before it gets away from you. And so I'm using the reel to move the bait a lot on a glide bait. On the real big ones, I've got kind of a fat spool here. If I can get this out, I've kind of got them tangled up. But I've got a really fat, wide spool. Holds a lot of 20-pound test. If you're using just a regular reel, and you sling one of those out there, well, you're going to empty the reel, and your reel ratio with no line is really different than with a full spool of line. So it's kind of foolish to throw them on the smaller reels. So when you're throwing a great big giant one with big line, a wide reel is really the way to go. And a lot of times you're throwing it on 20, 25-pound tests. So it's something that you've got to be able to hold a maximum, amount of line, sling it, and you can throw it a long ways and still have reasonable reel speed, winding it back on there, not just be empty.
Well, we got Lake Fork next week. Hopefully the Bassmaster Classic after that. What's next year going to be like for Cliff Pirch?
Well, I'm not sure yet. We don't know a lot of things. I know that they're working on a schedule, and we should see it any time. But I don't know yet. I don't know if we're going to start the same as we usually do. This year was a real odd year for me and everyone in the world. So, we had all kinds of delays and change of dates and stuff like that. But I do feel like we were really fortunate that the Bassmaster guys gave us a full schedule still. I just felt like there was a lot of times where we were 1 or 2 news cycles away from just not having a season. So I really felt fortunate that we're going to get them all in. But I don't know what next year brings, if we're going to just pick up right away, because we're ending so late, or if what it looks like. I haven't seen the new schedule, and I would suspect it'll be out pretty soon. And then once I find that out, I'll be able to figure out what Western events I can try to squeeze in. This year I got to squeeze quite a few in on the front end of the season and in the spring when we had some delays. So that was really nice. Got to fish some Wild West, some one bass, some bass junkies, stuff that's out here and closer to home. Roosevelt Lake was fishing well, and it's on the upswing. The fish there are growing full throttle. I think it's going to be a fantastic one over the next couple of years, barring any kind of virus or algae or anything like that. I'm looking forward to that, and so hopefully get some events here locally, and we'll see. I'll just try to fit in what I can, and I'm always looking for opportunities to fish out west. I haven't heard that the elites will be coming out, and I kind of suspect they're not this coming year, but I hope eventually we get to come back out here. I feel like I got to compete in those guys' backyard just week in and week out. And this year was a lot of travel back and forth. I really would love to have the Western advantage again, just for part of the season, to get a couple events where I just, have that experience on places that some of these other guys don't have. Every tournament they grew up fishing, is in their backyard. So coming out here, the last time they made a Western swing, there was a real distinct change in who led the points and who was in the top of the points and everything like that for quite a while. So I'd love to see a Western part of the schedule again. I kind of doubt we'll see it this year, but hopefully it happens again.
Well, Cliff, thanks so much for being with us today. You're a wealth of information. This is a great segment. Thanks for being with us, and good luck next week at Lake Fork. I'll be watching, and go get them.
Okay, I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure being on. I'm glad you could get me through the Zoom era. So
You and me both.
all right.
Take care.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
All right.